The morning of my wedding, I found out my grandfather had been keeping my mother's suicide note in a bank vault for 22 years. He told me while my dress was half-zipped. I want to start there, because everything else, the rehearsal dinner, my father's words, the walk down the aisle, only makes sense if you understand what it meant to be 8 years old and choose deliberately to lie to a police detective. I made that choice. I lived inside it for more than 2 decades. And on the afternoon I was supposed to be thinking about flowers and vows, and whether the DJ had the right playlist, my grandfather pulled a yellowed envelope from his suit jacket and handed me the reason I'd spent my entire childhood being blamed for my mother's death. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to where it started. My name is Mara Ellison. I'm 31 years old. My mother, Diane, died on the night of March 4, 2002 when I was 8. The official record says she lost control of her car on a rain-slicked county highway. The unofficial record, the one that lived in my body for 23 years, says she drove into a retaining wall at 65 miles an hour. I know this because I was the one who told the responding officer that she had swerved. The night she died, I was home in my room while my father received the call. My grandfather, Otto, arrived within the hour and took me and my 2 older sisters, Renata and Phoebe. I remember the waiting room, the industrial ceiling tiles, the way Grandpa Otto kept his hand on my shoulder. Dad walked past us on his way out. He didn't speak. That was the first night I understood that grief in our family would always move in one direction, outward, away from the source, and toward whoever was standing closest. The police came the next morning. I sat across from the detective in our dining room, Grandpa Otto in the corner behind him, and I lied. I said my mother had swerved. The detective asked me 3 different ways. I said yes every time. I'd found her empty prescription bottle in the bathroom trash the night before. 90 pills filled 8 weeks earlier, completely gone. I was 8 years old. I didn't know the clinical word for what the bottle meant, but I understood the conversation I'd overheard between Grandpa and my father the night before. If the insurance company determined it was intentional, the policy wouldn't pay. We'd lose the house, Renata's college fund, everything. So I said she swerved to avoid something in the road. The investigator closed his notebook and left. 6 weeks later, the insurance payout arrived. $540,000. We kept the house. Renata went to college. Phoebe got the orthodontia she needed. And I started carrying a weight that no one ever acknowledged, because no one knew I was carrying it. My father knew something else though. What I didn't learn until my wedding day was that he had quietly commissioned a private pathology review 3 days after my mother died. The results confirmed what the prescription bottle had already suggested. He knew. He knew the whole time, knew I had lied, knew why I had lied, knew what it had cost me to do it, and he chose every single day for 23 years to look at me as the reason his wife was gone. My 16th birthday, he didn't come home. My high school graduation, top of my class, full academic scholarship, he said he forgot. When my sister Renata married in 2017, I sat at the second-to-last table, near the venue's service entrance. He cried during the father-daughter dance. When Phoebe married 2 years later, his toast named only his 2 daughters. I was sitting 40 feet away. I drove home and pulled over twice because I couldn't see the road clearly. Grandpa Otto never stopped showing up. He paid my university tuition out of his pension, quietly without being asked, over 4 years. He bought me a used sedan when I couldn't afford one. When I'd call him after another birthday that passed without acknowledgement, he'd say, "Your father is wrong, Mara." "You know that," I'd say yes. I didn't always believe it. I met Callum the way people meet when they're not looking. He grabbed my coffee order by mistake at a cafe near my office, laughed about it, and asked if he could buy me another. He was 34, an urban planner, careful with his words in the way that meant he actually thought before speaking. I told him about my mother's death 6 weeks in. He didn't offer solutions. He just said, "That's a long time to carry something alone." I told him about my father's behavior at my sister's weddings on our 4th date. He said, "When we get married, you won't be sitting at the back." I said, "If." He said, "When." He was right. Callum proposed in February of last year. I called Renata first, then Phoebe. Then I called my father. He said congratulations, asked about the date, and before I could answer, said he hoped I wasn't expecting him to contribute. I said I wasn't. He said good and hung up. I told Callum he'd been happy for us. Some lies I'd learned exist to protect the people who love you from truths they can't fix. We planned the wedding ourselves, split the cost down the middle, accepted nothing from anyone except the presence of the people we wanted there. I sent my father a standard invitation in the spring. Formal, no handwritten note, just his name, and a meal option checkbox. He RSVP'd yes. Declined to walk me down the aisle. Selected the vegetarian entree. The rehearsal dinner was where everything broke. He arrived late, moved away from the table I'd assigned him, ordered a drink, and sat alone in the corner. Callum's father gave a warm, funny toast that ended with him looking at me and saying, "We're not adding a daughter-in-law. We're just adding a daughter." My father stared at his glass. Renata stood and said something about my surviving more than anyone in that room knew, and that I'd done it with more grace than I'd been given credit for. 70 people raised their glasses. My father did not. Then he stood. No one had called on him. He simply stood, waited for the room to go quiet, and said that tomorrow he'd be asked whether he was walking me down the aisle. He wasn't, he said. He wasn't walking someone else's mistake to the altar. The room held its breath. Someone's silverware clinked against a plate and the sound was enormous. Grandpa Otto, 83 years old, navy suit, the same one he'd worn to my mother's funeral, stood up slowly from across the room. He looked at me, not at my father. He said he would be honored to walk me down the aisle. Then he turned to my father and said quietly and without any particular drama that he was a coward. Then he held out his arm and we walked outside together. In the courtyard, under the string lights, he held both my hands and said, "Tomorrow I'm going to say something." I should have said it years ago. I asked what. He said I'd see. The next morning he came to my suite before the ceremony. He closed the door, sat down across from me, and pulled an unsealed envelope from his breast pocket. He told me that the day after my mother died, he'd gone to check on me while I was asleep. He'd seen the seam of my stuffed rabbit had been disturbed. He'd looked inside. He'd found the note she'd left, the one I'd hidden there because I understood, at 8 years old, that it couldn't be found. He'd kept it in a safety deposit box for 23 years. He'd never shown it to anyone. He said, "I was protecting you the way you protected us. But I protected the wrong person for too long." I asked him what he was going to do. He said he was going to tell the truth. All of it. In front of everyone. He asked if I wanted him to. I said yes. What followed, I will describe simply. My grandfather stopped us halfway down the aisle, turned to face the assembled guests, and read aloud from 3 documents. The original incident report, which noted the physical evidence contradicted my account, my mother's insurance policy, with its suicide clause, and its timeline, and finally my mother's note, which she had written in her own hand and which said, among other things, "Please don't blame them." My father stood when he heard his name. He left through a side door before the note was finished. Grandpa Otto watched him go and then said to the room, "That's what he's been doing her whole life." And then he turned to me and held out his arm and said, "Let's finish this." I reached the altar dry-eyed. Callum was crying. He took my hands and whispered, "Are you okay?" I said, "I am now." The reception held its own kind of grace. We danced, Grandpa Otto and I, to something slow and old, and he told me my mother was watching. I believed him. I cried for the first time all day, and he held me until the song ended. A week after the wedding, my father sent an email at nearly midnight. 39 words. He said he was sorry and that he needed time. I read it twice, showed it to Callum, and didn't respond. Callum asked if I was sure. I said I'd carried his grief for 23 years. He could sit with his own guilt for a while. We began family therapy in January, my father, my grandfather, and me, in a small office with 3 chairs arranged in a triangle. In the 4th session, my father said it plainly for the first time. He had known the truth from the beginning, And it had been easier to blame a child than to face the fact that he hadn't saved his wife. He cried when he said it. I didn't. I told him what I wanted was simple. I wanted him to admit that his cruelty had been a choice, not a symptom. He said I was right. I said I knew. He asked if I could forgive him. I told him I wasn't ready, but I was willing to show up every week and find out. He accepted that. Today, I am 31 years old, 11 months married, living in a 2-bedroom apartment with Callum in a dying houseplant we refuse to throw away. Renata and Phoebe host Sunday dinners. We're building something slower and sturdier than what we had before, something built on what's actually true rather than what we agreed not to say. My father is still in therapy. So am I. Some weeks I feel something like compassion for him. Most weeks I feel something closer to exhaustion. Neither of those is the same as forgiveness, and I've stopped pretending they are. Children shouldn't have to lie to hold families together. And the people who benefit from those lies don't get to decide the terms of their own redemption. Have you ever protected someone who never once thought to protect you back? And if so, how long did it take you to realize that wasn't love? That was just a very old debt you were never meant to owe.